North Ridge Hospital, a prestigious medical facility in the heart of the city, is known as a symbol of professionalism and high-quality service. Yet no one could have foreseen the test it would soon face with the arrival of Julia Thompson, a young and passionate nurse joining their team. Julia had no idea that behind the polished corridors and the professional smiles of her colleagues lay deep-seated prejudices she would encounter daily. As tensions began to rise and the sense of isolation became more apparent, Julia tried her best to remain patient and prove herself. However, amid the cold stares and rumors from her co-workers, she was unaware that one of her seemingly ordinary patients, a man named David Shaw, was silently watching it all unfold. But he was not just any patient. He held a secret that could change the fate of the entire hospital. What power does David Shaw hold? And how does Julia's resilience become the spark that lights the path to change? Where does the boundary lie between enduring and taking action to defend one's values? Join us as we dive into this gripping story. Before we begin, share where you're from. And if you love stories filled with emotion and justice, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the upcoming chapters. Julia Thompson, a young, passionate nurse with big dreams, eagerly stepped into North Ridge Hospital, where she believed she would find a great opportunity to advance her career. To Julia, this wasn't just a new job, it was a chance to prove her abilities and to become a part of one of the city's leading medical teams. Her mother's words of encouragement still echoed in her mind. "You can do it, Julia. Just stay determined, and nothing can stand in your way." With a smile on her face and a heart full of determination, she walked into the hospital's main lobby, where fluorescent lights illuminated the pristine white walls, giving the space an air of sophistication and professionalism. However, Julia's excitement quickly turned into a sense of unease when she noticed the cold glances passing over her. Every time she came near, conversations abruptly stopped, smiles faded, and were replaced by distant glances over shoulders. Julia felt as if she were intruding on a space where she was not welcome. When she tried to greet her new colleagues, she was met with indifferent nods or curt responses with no hint of warmth. "Hello, I'm Julia, the new nurse," she said with a warm smile, only to receive a quick glance from a colleague, followed by a dismissive, "Oh, hi. So you're the new one." These responses made it clear to Julia that she didn't belong, that her presence held little significance to them. The more Julia tried to fit in, the more she felt her sinking into isolation. She told herself that perhaps all she needed was time, that things would eventually get better. But day by day, hour by hour, the sense of being left out became clearer. She watched her colleagues laugh and chat easily with one another, while she remained on the sidelines like an invisible person. When Julia entered the nurse's break room, the lively conversations and laughter would abruptly fade into silence, and she'd feel the unfamiliar gazes looking at her as though she were an outsider. Every night, as she returned to her small apartment, an overwhelming emptiness and helplessness crept into her mind. "What have I done wrong?" she wondered, struggling with frustration. She remembered the nights spent staying up late studying, the endless shifts at the small hospital where she used to work. There, her former colleagues appreciated and valued her, but now in this new environment, Julia felt like a stranger. She tried to rationalize their coldness, reassuring herself that perhaps it was just because she was new, that they weren't used to her presence. But eventually, Julia couldn't deny a painful truth. The whispers when she passed by, the frowns when she was assigned to work alongside them, all pointed to the same conclusion: her presence was unwelcome, and the reason lay beyond her abilities. There were nights when Julia lay awake, tormented by thoughts of quitting, but then she remembered the promise she had made to herself not to let anyone or anything cause her to abandon her dreams. Her mother's encouraging words echoed in her mind: "Julia, you are stronger than they think. Don't let anyone dim your light." Each morning she put on her uniform, walked into the hospital hallways with squared shoulders and a determined gaze, though her heart remained heavy with unspoken conflicts and pain. One day, Julia was assigned to care for a special patient, Mr. David Shaw, a powerful businessman who had just undergone a serious car accident. He was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a mysterious smile, making many feel uneasy in his presence. His cold and unpredictable demeanor led other nurses in the hospital to maintain their distance, avoiding him whenever possible. Julia, with her sensitive yet resilient heart, ignored the rumors and whispered stories in the hospital's dark corners. For her, caring for patients was a mission, and she always treated every patient with utmost care and sincerity. From their very first encounters, Julia realized that David Shaw was not an easy patient. He often made seemingly unreasonable requests, from how to position his pillows to adjusting the room temperature. He rarely said thank you, offering only a brief nod as if her presence in the room was an insignificant part of his life. Yet Julia was undeterred. She cared for him with the same dedication she gave to all her other patients. Each morning she gently examined his wounds, adjusted his medications, and ensured he faced no inconveniences. No matter how cold he was, she maintained a professional demeanor, striving to provide him with maximum comfort. She believed that behind David Shaw's tough exterior, there might be a man enduring profound pain, a pain that only those with warm hearts could truly understand. But as Julia immersed herself in her responsibilities, she failed to notice that the discrimination against her in the hospital was becoming increasingly apparent. In the early days, she thought it might just be her feelings, that perhaps she just needed to try harder and everything would change. But then the harsh reality began to unfold. She was assigned the heaviest and most labor-intensive tasks, from caring for the most difficult patients to enduring continuous night shifts. Meanwhile, her white colleagues were given lighter duties and more comfortable shifts. Julia often found herself alone during the long nights when she struggled to transfer patients or perform other manual tasks that should have had support from her colleagues. On those evenings, while she was exhausted and stressed, her co-workers gathered in the break room, laughing and chatting merrily. Occasionally, she even heard their giggles echoing through the thin walls. The malicious gossip about her had ceased to be whispered secrets. Sometimes they didn't even bother to be discreet, openly saying to her face, "This hospital isn't for people like you." Their words hit Julia's self-esteem like a punch, forcing her to clench her fist to keep from trembling. Each sentence felt like a dagger, piercing her heart and bringing back painful memories of the discrimination she had faced since childhood. Julia's mind was torn between wanting to resist, to stand up for her rights, and the fear of the consequences of confronting an entire system where she knew she was at a disadvantage. She thought of her mother, of the advice from her family: "You must be resilient, prove your worth through your actions." But sometimes, on those long nights with no one to confide in, she couldn't help but wonder if her efforts were truly worth it. Would she ever be recognized for those attempts? Or would she forever remain a sideline shadow? Julia felt her heart divided. A part of her wanted to leave, to escape from a place where every step felt like treading on sharp thorns. But another part, the strong part within her, wanted to stay, to prove that she deserved to be there, that her presence was not merely an experiment someone had unwittingly conducted. Julia did not want to be a failure. She did not want those disparaging remarks to define who she was. Every morning when Julia entered David Shaw's room, she tried to maintain a strong facade, but deep inside she was battling an overwhelming sense of loneliness and hurt that was hard to fill. She told herself that she had to be stronger, to rise above it all. Yet the contemptuous glances and biting remarks trailed her like haunting shadows with every step. What she didn't know was that David Shaw, the man who silently observed everything, had begun to notice what she was enduring, and his presence could potentially change Julia's life at the hospital entirely. On a frigid winter morning, as dew still clung to the hospital windows, Julia quietly began her shift. The air in the corridor was cold and still, broken only by the sound of her shoes echoing on the polished tiles. Julia felt the weight of tension and pressure on her shoulders, but she reminded herself to persevere. No matter how much her colleagues' whispers and disdain suffocated her, Julia knew she was there for a purpose far greater: her desire to help others. However, that morning quickly turned into a nightmare. When Julia entered the examination room, she found an elderly patient lying on the bed, pale and breathless, with a weakening heartbeat. Looking at the monitor, she realized that the patient was experiencing a critical complication, with the risk of cardiac arrest at any moment. A chilling sensation spread through Julia as she grasped the severity of the situation, but she swiftly shifted from fear to action. Without hesitation, Julia sprang into action, her hands trembling yet her mind focused. She performed chest compressions, monitored the heartbeat, and called for the internal emergency team. Those moments seemed to stretch on forever. Each pulse, each breath of the patient felt like the rhythm of her own heart. Cold sweat dripped down Julia's forehead, but she didn't stop, refusing to let any negative thoughts invade her mind. Then, Just as she sensed the patient's heartbeat beginning to stabilize, the door to the room burst open, and Dr. Parker strode in with an angry expression. He was a formidable figure in the hospital, someone whom everyone feared. His voice thundered like a storm in the stillness, shattering all of Julia's efforts. "What do you think you know to act on your own? Are you trying to kill the patient?" he shouted, his cold eyes sweeping over Julia as if he wanted to tear through her very skin. Julia stood there, feeling frozen by Dr. Parker's harsh words. She had just saved the patient, a fact so evident that no one could deny it. Yet instead of being recognized, she was heavily criticized in front of everyone. Like a knife stabbing into her self-esteem, each of his remarks made Julia feel as though all her efforts had suddenly vanished. She sensed the gazes of her colleagues around her. Some avoided eye contact, while others looked at her with pity, as if she were a mistake, an outsider who didn't belong in this place. In that moment, Julia felt cornered. She wanted to scream, to argue back, to assert that she had done the right thing, that she didn't deserve to be treated this way. Dr. Parker's hurtful words swirled in her head, making her feel like a bird buried under layers of mud, unable to take flight. All the pent-up emotions, the indignation and sense of injustice engulfed Julia's mind. She had sacrificed so much, exhausted herself in her efforts, and yet now she was being disrespected to such a degree. But then, amidst the storm of emotions within her, a familiar voice echoed in her mind, like a glimmer of light in the overwhelming darkness. It was her mother's advice before Julia stepped into the medical field: never bow your head to injustice. Show that you are worth more than they think. Julia recalled the image of her mother, a strong woman who had raised her, always teaching her about resilience and confidence. Her mother had told her that being in medicine was not just about helping others, it was also about standing firm in the face of challenges, maintaining her worth even when others failed to see it. Julia took a deep breath, striving to remain calm amidst Dr. Parker's attack. She felt the powerful rhythm of her heart and the fire of determination igniting in her chest. She locked eyes with Dr. Parker, her voice soft yet resolute. "I only did what was necessary to save the patient." Her words resonated as an affirmation of her self-worth and the trust she held in herself. Though she understood the consequences she might face for standing up to someone as powerful as Dr. Parker, Julia felt no fear. She knew she had acted rightly, and no matter how they looked down on her, she would not let anyone undermine her dignity. Julia walked out of the room with her head held high, her heart filled with resolve, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Deep down, she recognized the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Yet, she believed she was strong enough to overcome it all, to prove that she was not only a talented nurse but also someone worthy of respect, regardless of what others thought of her. David Shaw, lying in his hospital bed, quietly witnessed the unfolding events through the keen eyes of a businessman who had weathered many storms. He could clearly see the humiliation and injustice Julia was enduring as Dr. Parker unjustly berated her and her colleagues treated her unfairly. Julia's gaze, despite her attempts to maintain composure, could not hide the hurt and helplessness she felt in the face of such blatant discrimination. In that moment, David realized it was time for him to act, not just to protect Julia, but also to change the deeply flawed system of this hospital rife with injustice. What no one knew was that David was more than just a patient. He was a powerful businessman and a board member of Northridge Hospital. Before being hospitalized, he had heard many whispers about the underlying racism in this place. Although the hospital was praised for its medical quality and professionalism, David could not ignore the murmurs about the unfair treatment of staff of color. Yet these were merely rumors, lacking concrete evidence, and no one dared to come forward to expose the truth. Thus, when a car accident unexpectedly landed David in this very hospital for treatment, he understood that this was the perfect opportunity to investigate and confront the existing issues within the hospital. He decided to keep his true identity hidden, not revealing that he was one of the most powerful figures here. He entered the hospital as an ordinary patient, listening and observing everything from the perspective of an outsider. During his days in the hospital, David quietly monitored the nurses and doctors around him, especially their treatment of Julia. He noticed clear signs of discrimination, from Julia being assigned strenuous tasks and night shifts to the sarcastic remarks and indifferent attitudes from her colleagues. The more he observed, the clearer the injustices and toxic environment became to him. He began to gather evidence, documenting instances of Julia's unfair treatment and situations where Dr. Parker displayed overtly biased behavior. But David did not stop at mere observation and note-taking. He skillfully began to intervene in the daily operations of the hospital. He posed difficult questions to Dr. Parker, demanding explanations about treatment protocols and how patients were treated. Each time an incident occurred, David requested private meetings with Dr. Parker to interrogate him about his handling of the situation. He did this not only to apply pressure but also to expose the lack of professionalism and discriminatory attitudes of the doctor in front of other staff members. This gradually caused Dr. Parker to lose his patience, revealing his dissatisfaction and prejudiced demeanor before those who witnessed their exchanges. However, David understood that his records alone would not suffice to change an entire system. He began to secretly contact other board members and healthcare oversight agencies, preparing for a comprehensive investigation into the hospital's work culture. He insisted on keeping his true identity confidential, ensuring that no one in the hospital knew he was monitoring their every action. When the board members agreed to participate in the covert investigation, David decided to move into the next phase of his plan. He began to encourage Julia to stand up for herself, motivating her that she didn't always have to endure injustice in silence. He sought ways to create opportunities for Julia to showcase her competence to other doctors, making it impossible for them to deny her talent. David even secretly sent documentation and evidence of Dr. Parker's discriminatory behavior and that of other nurses to oversight agencies in preparation for the forthcoming official investigation. But what David did not anticipate was the fierce reaction from Dr. Parker upon realizing he was under scrutiny. Dr. Parker began to display more contempt and defiance, believing that David was merely a powerless patient not worthy of his concern. This arrogance ultimately led to a heated confrontation between the two, a showdown that David knew he would win, not just through his power but through the truth and justice. The battle between David and the discriminatory elements at North Ridge Hospital had reached a point of no return. With the evidence David had gathered, he was ready to deliver a decisive blow, not only to protect Julia, but also to bring fairness to all the other staff members in the hospital. David Shaw, once a quiet patient, had now become the leader of a revolution, forcing North Ridge Hospital to confront the dark corners they had tried to keep hidden for so long. After weeks of patiently gathering evidence, David Shaw decided it was time to expose everything. He called for an urgent meeting with Dr. Parker and the hospital's leadership. Julia, who had never attended such high-level meetings, was surprised when she received the invitation to join. She entered the meeting room feeling bewildered, uncertain about what awaited her. The room was filled with a tense atmosphere as everyone settled in. David Shaw stood up, slowly removing his glasses and fixing his sharp gaze on Dr. Parker, making it clear to everyone present that something serious was about to unfold. "I am David Shaw, a board member of this hospital," he began, his voice warm yet authoritative. "For some time now, I have been closely observing your behavior, and what I have witnessed is truly disgraceful." The air seemed to freeze. Everyone in the room, from Dr. Parker to the other nurses, was taken aback by David's revelation. Dr. Parker's face turned pale, his previous self-satisfied and contemptuous remarks now swallowed by a chilling silence. Julia, sitting in the corner of the table, felt her heart racing in her chest, unable to comprehend that the man she cared for daily was one of the most powerful individuals in the hospital. David continued, his voice firm and unyielding. He systematically presented what he had witnessed, from how Julia was assigned the most difficult tasks to her, enduring mockery and disrespect from colleagues. He not only condemned Dr. Parker's behavior, who had previously been regarded as an absolute authority, but also pointed out each instance of unprofessionalism, from the abuse of power to the complicity of other staff members in maintaining a toxic environment. "We take pride in the quality of our healthcare, but that cannot obscure the truth that the culture of this hospital is rotting from within," David said, each word resonating powerfully. "Discrimination, the disdain for minority staff, and the complicity of those in power, all of it will no longer be tolerated." The tension in the meeting room reached its peak. Pale faces exchanged glances, desperately searching for an excuse, but no one dared to speak. Dr. Parker, who had always been confident and arrogant, was now left with anxiety and dismay. He realized that his actions could no longer be concealed beneath the facade of power. David did not stop there. He demanded not only strict action against the individuals involved, but also a comprehensive plan to reform the workplace culture of the hospital. He called for the implementation of training programs on equality and respect, and the establishment of a monitoring system to prevent any future discriminatory behavior. He wanted to ensure that every employee, from nurses to doctors, was treated fairly and given opportunities to develop based on their actual abilities rather than on their skin color or status. Julia sat quietly, tears welling in her eyes. She never expected that amidst the dark days, there would be someone quietly observing and standing up for her. The feeling of helplessness and the pain she had endured for so long began to dissipate, replaced by hope for a brighter future, not just for herself but for all the other minority staff members silently suffering. David concluded the meeting with a resolute statement. "Today I urge us to change. For we are not just a hospital, we must also be a place where anyone, whether staff or patient, feels respected and treated fairly." The entire room fell into silence, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of awakening. David's words had stirred the conscience of everyone present, and they understood that this was not just a personal confrontation, but a pivotal moment to change the entire system. David stood up, looking each person in the room in the eye before concluding his remarks. He emphasized that Julia, who had endured discrimination and contempt all this time, was in fact one of the most valuable assets that North Ridge Hospital was fortunate to have. Julia not only saves lives, but she also embodies the true qualities of a nurse: patience, dedication, and the ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. This is what this hospital needs to learn from her, not to hold in disdain. David's words rang out like thunder, making the atmosphere in the conference room heavier than ever. Julia sat there, feeling each word as a breath of fresh air blowing into her heart, which had grown calloused from months of suffering and injustice. She felt choked up, not only because of David's unexpected defense, but also because she was finally recognized not just for her nursing abilities, but for who she was as a person. The people in the meeting, from senior doctors to longtime nurses, dared not voice any objections. Dr. Parker, once the center of power in the hospital, was now left with only embarrassment and confusion. His face was pale, his eyes avoiding contact with anyone. He understood that there was no room left for excuses or justifications. Everything he had built, his arrogance and pride, was now shattered in just one meeting. The meeting ended in a chilling silence. The members of the leadership bowed their heads in a commitment to change. Promises were made, comprehensive investigations would be conducted, in-depth training on diversity and inclusivity would be implemented, and new policies would be established to ensure that every employee was treated with respect and fairness. Dr. Parker and those exhibiting discriminatory behavior were reassigned and even suspended to set an example for the entire hospital. Julia stood up and walked out of the conference room, feeling as if she had just shed an enormous weight. She was no longer the lonely nurse who had to grit her teeth and endure injustice. She had become a part of the change, a catalyst for transformation within the system. As she walked down the hospital corridor, the glances that had once been cold and contemptuous now shifted. A few people nodded slightly, even offering her a small smile. Although she knew that this change would take time to take root, it was a hopeful new beginning. David Shaw, from a distance, watched Julia walk away, feeling a sense of relief and satisfaction that he had not felt in a long time. He saw not just a hospital beginning to change, but also a strong Julia, an employee who had dared to confront injustice and would never back down. That day, not only Julia but also the entire North Ridge Hospital turned a new page. A chapter about justice, compassion, and the refusal to judge individuals solely based on their skin color or status. Julia knew that the road ahead would still hold many challenges, but she no longer had to walk it alone. She had allies, people like David Shaw, and more importantly, she had regained her faith in herself. Julia stepped outside, inhaling the fresh air of the late afternoon. The setting sun illuminated her face, a face filled with determination and hope. She remembered her mother's words, "Never bow your head to injustice." Now she not only held her head high but also knew that she had done the right thing, and from that moment on, a brighter future would unfold for both herself and others in the hospital.